what I see happening with a global crisis coming.
The next crisis will be bigger.
We're also forecasting the Greatest Depression.
The correction and the collapse and getting rid of the bubbles has been built into the system. It's been going on for 10 years, so it's there. You can't stop it.
So what you've engendered here is most likely a protracted period of stagflation, which is going to lead to an epic and massive crash.
And we believe it will hit after the 2020 presidential reality show is over. A primary reason why we also forecast a gold bull run is that the Federal Reserve is going to continually lower interest rates.
That's why the probability that the Fed cuts interest rates at its next meeting in July is now 100%.
So there is a lot of buzz that the Federal Reserve is about to cut interest rates, and it might actually happen. We'll see. But if it does happen, it will directly contradict the carefully crafted narrative about the economy that the Federal Reserve has been perpetuating all this time. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has repeatedly insisted that the U.S. economy is in great shape.
The economy has performed reasonably well, with solid fundamentals supporting continued growth and strong employment,
even when there has been a tremendous amount of evidence indicating otherwise. And of course, President Trump has been repeatedly telling us that
this is the greatest economy that we've had in our history.
But now he's loudly calling for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates as well. Something doesn't seem to add up here. If the U.S. economy really was booming, there is no way that the Fed should cut interest rates. Right now, interest rates are already low by historical standards, and theoretically, it is during the boom times that interest rates should be normalized. But if the U.S. economy is actually slowing down and heading into a recession, then a rate cut would make perfect sense. And if that is the reality of what we're facing, then the economic optimists have been proven dead wrong, and people like me that have been warning of an economic slowdown have been proven right. If the talking heads on television are correct, we'll probably see a rate cut. In fact, apparently there are some people that are even pushing for a 50 basis point cut. Most Fed watchers believe that the central bank will cut its funds rate, now hovering between 2.25% and 2.5% by a quarter point, also known as 25 basis points. A small group, including President Donald Trump's latest nominee for Fed governor, are pounding the table for a 50 basis point cut, which would take the rate below 2%. A rate cut of any size would be the first since the 2008 financial crisis. However, interest rate cuts aren't typically associated with a growing economy. As Ann Safir of Reuters reminds us, the last time the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates was during the depths of the financial crisis more than a decade ago. Since the Fed's last rate-setting meeting in mid-June, U.S. home sales tumbled. Manufacturing has been weak for months, and exports are down. A report on Friday showed robust consumer spending kept the U.S. economy growing at a 2.1% pace in the second quarter, a smaller slowdown than expected, but it also underscored the weak business investment and inflation that has worried Powell. Any cut now would be ill-timed and ill-advised. To the extent that the economy faces headwinds, it's because of Trump's trade and tariff policies, not because interest rates are too high. A 50 basis point cut is something that would normally only be done during an economic emergency. Have we already reached such a point? That wouldn't seem to be the case. Unemployment is near record lows because many Americans work multiple jobs but still live paycheck to paycheck. They need extra income. Many Americans still face financial instability despite economic growth. National labor market data over the past few years show a strong, high-performing economy, but those big-picture numbers do not include microeconomic indicators that reflect the more difficult reality of many Americans' financial lives. For example, a recent Gallup survey shows that 40% of Americans say they are running into debt or barely making ends meet. A third of respondents in a 2014 Pew Charitable Trust survey reported having no savings, and more recent polling shows that many people do not have sufficient resources on hand to deal with an emergency. To gain additional insight into the way Americans are affected by the changing economy and what they want out of it, Pew conducted a series of in-depth interviews in 2018 with a diverse group of workers and employers in 8 cities and 3 rural areas around the country. The workers had salaries of no more than $75,000 a year. The interviews focused on the interrelationships between employer and employee needs and people's sense of their economic mobility. The results highlight the continued economic pressures many people feel, despite the nation's low unemployment rate and record high stock market. Many Americans in this wage bracket continue to struggle to balance work and family or make career changes that could give them more financial security. Stock prices are still at record highs, and at least according to the government's highly manipulated figures, U.S. GDP is still growing. The nation's gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced in the U.S., increased at a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 2.1% in the April-June period, following a 3.1% gain in the first quarter, the Commerce Department said Friday. Economists expected a 1.8% increase in output. The report comes amid mounting worries that the sluggish global economy and President Trump's trade war with China could lead to a recession by next year. Those fears have bolstered expectations that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates this week for the first time in a decade to head off a potential downturn and help lift stubbornly weak inflation. Yes, there are tons of other indicators that are clearly telling us that the next economic collapse has already begun. And I'm not going to repeat everything that I've been saying for the past 6 months in this article. But even though things are definitely moving in the wrong direction, I would definitely not call what we are currently experiencing an economic emergency just yet. Unfortunately, when things get really bad in this country, money is going to start getting really tight, and we simply are not there yet. So, could it be possible that there is another reason for the sudden push to get the Fed to reduce rates? Well, CNBC's Steve Leisman seems to think there could be a political motivation. Think about what happens when a person gets up at a rally and starts railing against the Federal Reserve and starts to create what could lead to congressional pressure on the Fed. Then you could imagine that there could be support for a different system. I think they think there's a lot of political downside risk to getting this wrong. If the Federal Reserve doesn't cut rates and the U.S. economy really starts going off the rails, they will be President Trump's #1 economic target during the 2020 campaign. And it has already gotten to the point where Trump is regularly attacking them on social media. For example, he posted the following just a little while ago. The Fed raised way too early and way too much. Their quantitative tightening was another big mistake. While our county is doing very well, the potential wealth creation that was missed, especially when measured against our debt, is staggering. We are competing with other countries that know how to play the game against the U.S. That's actually why the EU was formed. And for China, until now, the U.S. has been easy pickings. The Fed has made all of the wrong moves. A small rate cut is not enough, but we will win anyway. If a wave of anti-Fed sentiment helps get Trump re-elected, that could potentially be a nightmare scenario for the folks over at the Federal Reserve. With a full second term and a Republican majority in Congress, President Trump could decide to dramatically reform or completely get rid of the Federal Reserve System altogether. Of course, those that follow my work regularly know that I would be thrilled by this, because I have been advocating for the elimination of the Federal Reserve System for many years. The sort of political scenario that I just outlined probably won't happen. But even if there is a small chance that it could happen, the people running the Federal Reserve have got to account for that possibility. So, cutting rates would be a way to play it safe by appeasing President Trump and his supporters. If President Trump senses that the Fed is on his team, then he probably won't be inclined to make a big move against them. In any event, a small rate cut is definitely not going to do much to alter our overall economic trajectory, because the truth is that an economic slowdown has already begun, and many experts are anticipating that it will greatly accelerate during the second half of this year.